Last week I said you have to start off with a three-dimensional shape first. And after you do the three-dimensional shape, you continue and dress this three-dimensional shape with the detail, with the specific detail. So in this case, what we're going to do is capture the three-dimensional shape of what's sitting underneath and then draw the etching on top. The problem here is that you guys don't work enough on this level and think all the work is on this level. This is wrong. The most important part of any armor designs or any kind of specific textures is getting down the shadows first, establishing it as the form study. Form study, what do you mean form study? I mean the form studies that I do on my DeviantArt page. Which is basically studying form for form's sake. It's really all about edges, cubes, polygons, keeping your mind sculpting, and some sort of sculpting mentality. This is some of the form studies that I've done last year. They were pretty early last year. I did them. When did I submit this? April 13th, so that's pretty early. And I need to do another one because I do one every year, like early in the year, to see how far I've improved. This is form studies. This is what you're supposed to be doing, just this doesn't have a texture or a very specific detail on it. So it's nondescript, doesn't have a specific label on it. So that's why we have to find the form first, before, and so that it makes sense with a light source, because light source is how we're seeing this object. And you got that down pretty good, pretty well. So so what we have to do now is treat it again with more presence of the light source. I think what you're missing here are the major heights of the light, the high points that the light reaches and how it travels across the angles. So different parts of this armor are facing at different angles. And remember, light source is always emanating vectors, lights that come out of it, and areas that are exposed to those vectors. So the light in this case, in this image, is coming down this way. So if there's an area that is angled like a plate, imagine them as satellites. If a satellite is pointing this way, then the signal is going to be good. If the satellite is pointing this way, there's not going to be any signal. Signal basically is what I mean by the highlight on top. So this is really high signal. This is low signal. I know I'm weird when I teach, but just try to imagine it with me. Imagine every one of these plates here as a satellite, and if it's angled perfectly at the light, it'll get the highlight on it. If it's not, it'll get a degree less compared to the one that is the most efficient, the one that is facing the light source directly. So everything is a climb down from the highlight, and the best way to really take on a form study and to sculpt, when you want to sculpt, you either work dark to light or light to dark. It really doesn't matter, whichever one you feel best with. I usually work dark to light so that I could at least get the basic forms down and really play around and have fun with the highlight. So what I recommend you do here is you need to first lighten all of this up. So I'm going to use the, whoopsie. Okay. Lighten. I'm going to lighten this. So I want to take away the darks that you've used, and I want to use them only where they're really needed. I'm also going to jump into liquefy, and you see this straight line that runs across the sternum, like right there? It's kind of working like the symmetry line of the body. I want to get that to be straight because it is armor, so it's geometric, so it's been pieced together. If it looks too wobbly and wonky, it's not going to feel like a really strong, like a blacksmith's hand really shaped this together and put it together as the geometric thing that it is. It's very planned out, very symmetrical, not so organic. And what I'm going to do is work dark to light. So I'm going to use burn tool to save me some time. And I'm just slowly building the shadows, and as I build these shadows, my brush shrinks. So the more darkness that I introduce, the smaller my brush gets, and I will change in between shadows and midtones. Okay, working my way up. Next up is you really want to be able to see this form without all the detail. So you got to look away from the detail for a second. You can't think about the detail. You have to just try to catch the basic plate underneath. Squinting your eyes really helps because squinting your eyes cancels out a lot of detail and lets you see the really large pieces of light and shadow. So everyone repeat that back to me. What does squinting your eyes do for your painting process? If you already have really bad eyesight, you just have to take off your glasses and you don't need to squint. But this is another way to do it. shows the form. Exactly, Shiro Lotus. Really just shows off the large pieces and the small pieces of light. Why is it important to know the large pieces and the small pieces of the light? Why is that important? What size is my brush right now? All these little speckles you have, you didn't need those. What you really needed is just these large and small pieces. It decreases detail and shows light. Very good job, Mordub. Shows light and shadow. Next thing I'm going to do is get Dodge Tool, and I'm going to brush Dodge Tool over and try to build that highlight the way it moves across. So we've got light, light, light. So squint your eyes again. You see this really white line separating these two areas. And then you've got a really bright spot over there, which will darken because we're going to throw detail over it. So that's going to work as a micro texture that gets in the way of the light. And the next piece is kind of like a depression. So it really works as something like this. Kind of has that actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to just pretend like it cuts off early. And this is stuff that you will read if you just use references. Kind of looks like Batman's logo. And getting the edge is so important. So important. But I'm going to select the inverse. I'm going to get the edge down. Clean that up. Let's see what everyone's saying. We can, thanks, didn't know that. Up and close bracket. Did you guys answer my question? What was the question anyways? I'm really forgetful right now. So what I'm going to do is get some of this light and throw it over on this side and on this side. And you see that small shadow here? I'm squinting my eyes and I'm seeing this small shadow. This looks like a spine. And that's the light that you have there. So that's like a tiny spine in between the scales. And this is the part where you want to spend all your hours on. This is where all the work happens. Right here. The second question, I forget what the second question. I think it was, why is it important to know what the larger, and yeah, there it is. Why is it important to know what the larger and smaller pieces of light are? And I asked, what's the size of my brush? But that was back then. Basically, it tells you what to do with your large brush in the early stages of the painting. It's really good to know. And so it's light, dark. Oh, so it's light, dark, light. But one of them is less light than the other. But we just want to catch that spine. And this area is generally darker than this area, and it kind of just softly transitions. So it's a very soft, leathery surface. It's not metallic. It's very leathery. It's like folded leather. And we just want to slowly build up our shadows. You don't want to start off with a dark thing like this. You want to work light to dark, because the piece underneath has a shadow, cast shadow, and then it becomes light. And that's pretty much, this is my process. I work most of the hours on getting the plates down, the basic shades down. Because if you don't do that, you don't create a light environment. It'll look like really off. It'll look like it doesn't belong in that room. And I'm just balancing the highlights. Some highlights carry all the way down into these pieces. This spine piece here isn't that disconnected. And zooming out is very, very important. It's like squinting without squinting. That's how what zooming out does for you. Carry that there. Carry that to the top there. And this shadow travels all the way down. And then we get that highlight that needs to be a little bit, damn it, a little bit more planned. Okay. A little bit more of a deliberate shadow. Oops. Deliberate highlight, sorry. I'm shrinking the brush with open and close brackets. Just like we see here, I'm making it a little bit darker. So it's more of a demonstration of how I do textures today. Thank you for the opportunity for whoever did this homework, as I requested last time. But I will look at the homework from other days and apply the lesson of last time into this homework. Okay, and this is pretty much the most important part. This little tedious balance of shades and making sure everything reads the same way. And if you find it very, very hard to see past the detail, you can always blur this. I would blur it or use another distortion tool to blur it for me, because then I'll see the actual shadows I need. That's really important. Double the layer, get 2 layers and double it so that you can see these shadows. And it's coming in pretty close. So a lot of the feeling of the surface texture is in the actual scale work, and this is going to be it's going to be very easy to throw that part in. I'll show you how I would do it. But this part right here is pretty much the most important bit. There's a shadow running over it here. Almost done with this. Runs all the way down. Okay, the next part I pretty much just separated. I don't really keep it connected, and this is pretty much what I do. I try to get the pattern with a really hard brush because I know that the texture is so detailed I can't afford to use any soft brush or any opacity decrease. I have to make sure I'm using as sharp a brush as possible because the knife used to etch these in was sharp, so it gives off a sharp feeling. And I'm not going to try to copy every single one of them individually, and what I usually do is start a new layer and just throw some scales in. So throw some scale patterns. I just get the general pattern, the way the artist etched these in, and I just do my own version. And this saves a lot of time. So this is why I'm saying you have to use the time that you have. So I'm going to throw some pieces here. The time that you have only on the sculpting. This other bit here is just tedious detail. And this is how I would do it. I would erase away some bits that don't fit in and merge that down. You get a larger piece and you just keep going with it. And I would use this over and over again, and I would draw over areas where I can't really sneak pieces into, and I don't want to edit too much, because then depending cut and paste is not good for the final outcome. And there's some areas that look off, so these areas I would clean. And this is all you need. This right here is all you need. Let's double that, save this for later, and throw this over top. I'm going to see it's about the same size. And what happens here, though, it's not just perfect lines. What's happened is they are a different color, so I'm going to turn on the opacity layer. It's a different color. I'm also going to get the clone stamp just to fill in where I don't have any detail. Oopsie. Where I don't have any detail at the moment. And I'm just going to worry about this side for now. What I usually do to also save time, especially because I never really usually paint this kind of extensive detail just for my own personal work. It's usually something to do with client work or concept art. And I rarely get client work that has to do with this much detail, like they need that much detail for modeling or writing. And what you want to see at this point is you have to change these lines, which are just symbols at the moment, into three-dimensional, something that represents something three-dimensional. So if we look at these lines here, what's happened is these lines have two lines beside them. They've got the dark and the light. This is the depression. This is where it goes in and dips in. So what we have to do is create the feeling that this has, so if this was a piece of tape traveling over, it would fall inside the depression and then come back out. This side here is where the light is being caught. So you always have to ask yourself, where is the light source? And that's what we have to do at this time. We have to find where the light source is. The light source is coming out of this way. So what I usually do is I go into stroke, turn it on this. I know it's crazy right now. Opacity, maybe I'll do it on the inside. The inside. Does that work? Nah. Outside. And turn down the opacity just a little bit. I might do a drop shadow. Depends. This allows me to control where the light source is coming from. And then I decrease the distance as short as possible. Do you see that instant change in the way we're seeing this texture? It's very close to what we see here. You have to treat everything as a three-dimensional object. And I'm using these effects here to save me time, but you should be painting these in. If you have to use these effects, use them to save time for yourself as well. But we're not done. We're still not done. There's a lot of shading that goes into this level, this next stage, and a lot of erasing. So what I'm going to do is erase a little bit. Erase some of this because it's getting in the way. It's too bright in certain areas. I'm going to turn this on, opacity, lock, and then get burn tool on highlights, and I want to get rid of only the areas where there's really light exposure. Do we have that second line of light that shows off the three-dimensional? And that's where I'm gonna darken anywhere where there isn't any of that light. Just around here. Actually, there is a little bit on that side. And this area has very little. And then I'm going to erase away some more of it. So that this is the point. Everything is three-dimensional, even the stuff that looks like it's flat. And if you treat that as a three-dimensional object, you'll get that feeling of whatever it is you're going for. If it's a 3D scale, if it's fur. If you treat it as a three-dimensional object that can cast shadows and has inner depressions and sides to it, then you'll always draw something that looks realistic. So I'm getting a very, very general, and I'm going to merge the two together, but I'm getting a very general shadow, and I'm liking how it looks. Probably going to decrease opacity just a little bit. As long as we're treating it as a three-dimensional object, it reads. Do you see these white lines? This is the side of that depression that was etched in from the light source. And that's the stuff you have to look out for. So the person this basically is an answer to the person's question. He had no idea what to do with these lines, and that's because you were thinking like as if they were actual lines. They're not lines. They're real depressions. I'm going to duplicate that, and then I'm going to lighten these lines just a little bit because I don't want to use too dark a line. So I've lightened them. And now I'm going to treat it even further as a three-dimensional object. And I'm going to get burn tool again. I'm sorry, I don't have time. I'm going to use shadows, and I'm going to darken the darkest inner part of every one of these etches. So only the part that's darkest. And the rule goes, wherever there is light, there is contrast. So I'm going to leave this dark. So you see, you're always trying to leave your darks for when you really need them, the crucial moments. I'm going to zoom out, see if that's reading. And the crucial moments are where you have contrast that you need, and that's what creates detail. Detail can be created with high contrast without having to shrink your brush. So I don't have to go in there and clean up any of this. All I have to do is just use contrast strategically. And that ensures that I'm using the most of my darks, and I'm not depending on one big black stroke. Maybe that's why it looked so awkward to you when you were doing the study. You were using one black line that wasn't really doing anything for you. And you see now everything's starting to look a little bit three-dimensional. And these etches are probably big bumps. So I want to, when I place in the highlight in a little bit, I want to just make it feel like these are actual bumps that are getting light off of them. Now it's not looking exactly like what we see here, but we're working from it. We're working from this as a guide for how the form behaves, and most importantly, texture behavior or brush behavior. Our brush is behaving along the nature of how this was created, which was etches. We got a knife and we sort of carved along the leather, and that's what you have to do. Behave as if you are actually working on a three-dimensional world, and render around that three-dimensional whatever happened to create this texture. So you have to do research. If it's fur, you have to find out what kind of fur is it. Is it matted fur? Is it completely soft? Is it really necessary to go in and draw every single stroke of hair or every little fur hair? So I'm going to zoom out because zooming in can really mess up with your core shadows. This whole area is wrong. And then I'm going to get the next level. So you see this big highlight here. I save it for later. I didn't just jump in. And what you do is you choose your lightest spot, and then you work from down from that. So you choose the radius, the hot spot, and that's what you work from. So that's, you know that this piece right here is going to be one of the brightest pieces, and everything is a step down from that. So I'm going to zoom out. So you're reading your reference means you're reading the form first. You're getting the basic shadows down. You're setting up a plate for all this detail work. And all your work is supposed to go into that initial sculpting. And I'm just going to carry that highlight, squinting my eyes again and trying to see the pattern that that highlight travels in. And there's one last layer. So this is really rushed, but there's one last layer, and it would be like this is where you bring in that stipple layer. And I just throw in a general mess of brush strokes. Probably sharpen the edges, or sharpen, unsharp mask. Oh, whoops, I threw it in the wrong layer. I'll probably have to increase the size of my brush. You just want to get that worn look, that maybe I'll use this one. Just trying to get that sort of weathered look. And that's working in different layers. Not layers on Photoshop, layers of rendering. You're getting down the texture first. And then you throw in the sub-texture, or the next level of texture. So I'm sorry I'm not looking at the comments. I will in a second, but I just wanted to demonstrate how awesome it is to start off with the 3D object first. And how to take your time using the darks and the whites. And always remember that you're sculpting. This is a form study. You're always sculpting. And this is all prep work. You can go back and paint over all of this work so that you can get that painterly feel and not that digital cleaned up feeling. I kind of like the painterly feel. So I usually go back and clean it up. But this is how I do it. You take it level by level and discover kind of what's sitting around that texture before jumping in and trying to take all of that at once. Because trying to take all of that at once is what's going to give you a failed project. That's what's going to make you fail. And I'll probably get another stippling brush, probably something like this. Just like that, very, very delicate stipples. And only where there is truly some light. And then I'd erase with a stipple brush. So this is another tip. If you guys paint with a stipple brush, erase with a stipple brush. Don't erase with a soft brush or a hard brush. You want to reinforce that texture. So erasing with a stipple brush is going to help you. And we're getting much, much closer to this texture right here. I probably would paint over it one more time. I'd get a really, really small brush. So this is like the major, final detail on the final hour. So I did this in a couple minutes. That's not really a demonstration of how much time I would spend on this. I would spend lots more time. But I hope this gives you like the basic framework of how I go about doing this kind of intense texture and detail. So I just go and place the shadows only where I know they really need it, always thinking about the light source. So this side would be darker. And make sure to zoom out every couple brush strokes because you might be messing up a core shadow you established early on. And you don't want to mess up those shadows. These are shadows you worked for that looked right at one point. So it's looking okay. I want to probably increase my opacity the lighter I get. When I enter this zone, it becomes very tricky to use a dark because the zone, the local color is very, very bright. Yeah, there is contrast, but only in tiny, tight spots that are the darkest places that completely look away from the light, like they're craters on the moon. So that's how you read your references. That's how you read a texture. You read how the texture originally started. try to imitate it in the way you brush. Try to imitate the way the actual texture happened in the real world. It'll help you organize your process a lot better. I'm going to zoom out. Now I'm just going to find a stipply brush, probably something with texture in it. Get that white and paint it in there using the reference. So interrupt some of that texture that I added in. And finally, after I'm done, I just brush over it with a sharpened brush because my brushes are always on transfer, and that kind of throws me off, but I love transfer, the transfer setting. Gives me more control over the brushes. So I'm just cleaning up some of the choices I made here, getting rid of those really, really strong stipples. And then at the very end of all of this, I'm going to cast some shadows. Just trying to get those highlights in there. And some of that burn, always on shadows. Probably keep it on protect tones. I'm just cleaning some more. And at this point I zoom out because I want to make sure that I'm not ruining any of the stuff that I did. And I would take more time than I did here to make those little grooves that I used as a pattern. And you can paint them in by hand if you have the time. And this is where you get comfortable enough to just lay back and just start texturing and casting some shadows. So I'm kind of seeing them as scales instead. I'm not really seeing them as etches anymore, but it still serves the purpose. Okay. Still uneven. They're kind of uneven scales, but it's okay. Just carrying that highlight all the way down so the light travels in this kind of angle. So I'm just trying to imitate that. And what I usually do, I usually take a step back if I really want to push the rendering as far as possible. And I just, actually, okay, I just decrease opacity in that area. The size of everything is too big. And after I decrease opacity, it gives me another chance to be even more picky with my brush strokes, to be even more particular with the lights that I use. So I go down one more level. This means that I really have to choose where I place these highlights next time. And slowly work up. So this looks a bit messy compared to this. I didn't have time to create a really, really clean pattern. This is pretty much the way you have to work. I'm going to highlight the side of this spine right here. This highlight. And you want to carry this texture all the way in. See here how it's very similar to what we see here. We don't see the darks, but we see the light side. And I'm just going to sharpen that. I'm going to use a lighten layer over this whole area with a soft brush because it gets pretty light around the radius here. Oops. Wherever there's a tiny bit of shadow. And then darken one more time, but only the shadows. And that's pretty much it. It's okay if you didn't do homework today. And then lighten. And you want to just continue this texture all around, sharpening only where you know you need to. And then after everything, I use an unsharp mask. And that pretty much reads to me, it's not as clean as this one, but it still reads as some sort of scale. It'll work with all kinds of textures, just making sure that you're always thinking about how that original texture was sculpted. And you want to see it like this. Is it, if we really zoomed up, would it be something like this? So this is the etch of that scale. So the light is coming from this direction. This is the shadow. So this is the dark part, and this is that white line that I added with the drop shadow. So this is what's happening on a really, really close scale. We're seeing, sorry, my sweater, it's too hot. We're seeing the shadow, the cast shadow, and then the light side. But if you're thinking about the texture, again, thinking about how the texture started, where if it was a scale, we would see a scale and another scale underneath it, and another scale underneath that, and then another scale underneath that, all the way down. So what we really see is this is the light bit, and then this is a cast shadow. So what you actually paint with your brush, you create a white plate. So you work with the white form structures, whatever it is you have to, whatever values you have to use, and then you cast the shadow. This scale shape that you're casting, that's the shadow of this scale. So you're drawing the shadow. You can't really draw the light piece. You have to draw its shadow in order to show off the light piece. So that's why you have to think on a really, really small level, on a really microscopic level, how this texture is happening, so that you know what to do with your brush. And that's called brush behavior. The brush behavior has to reflect the actual way this texture happened. And your three-dimensional plate, you have to establish that first, because it is still a three-dimensional thing. This is given. This is a given. You have to make sure that this is pretty much very general principles that apply to developing how dark it is in certain areas, how reflective it is. And then when you think about the texture, you have to think about how it happens on a microscopic level. This is a cross-section of how this texture happened on this armor. So I hope that answers your question. Sorry I didn't have more time to really develop this. I don't know what I said. And show you how extensive the detail can reach. If you work on that really, really picky, be careful with your whites, be careful with your blacks. Work on that really picky, in that really picky way. You'll get something that reads a lot better. I wish I had more time because now I'm having fun. Maybe I should do my own little studies of textures. That same texture that we had before, same thing but on this side, but on a much smaller level. So that's why we get our light levels first, and then darken everything under that. I'm going to use lighten on soft brush and just clean that up. It's a pretty light piece compared to the others. I would need to see the piece underneath to cast this shadow. This cast shadow right here is proof that this is a three-dimensional object. That's something you need to use in your drawing to prove that three-dimensional object is real. Okie dokes. That's it for this. I hope that answered your question. If you need any more help, please let me know on the Google+. Try it. Try this exact method. I really want to see what you come up with. I'd love to see sort of how you separate the three-dimensional and the actual texture behavior. And then we've got this. I wanted to cover hair. When it comes to hair, it's the exact same thing. We have to find the texture behavior after we find a three-dimensional object. So this three-dimensional object is one big sphere. So I'm not sure which piece you're reading. You're probably seeing like a completely different piece. Like you're probably looking at a completely different kind of hair. But let's think of it as a three-dimensional object. The light is falling in this direction. This piece would cast a shadow on this piece. And we just work our way down into the darks. It's really important that you're not using all of the darks that you have access to. And this cast shadow right here is very, very important. This is a cast shadow. This is a cast shadow. This is a cast shadow. We're emerging the hair out of the shadow. So that's why we have to start dark to light, Then we add in our highlight. Remember, our brush is very, very big at this point. We want to keep our brush big. And you've got this cast shadow. Let me use a different brush. There's a special brush I use for hair. This cast shadow here. This cast shadow here. You want to get the bigger pieces out of the way. That's when you squint your eyes, but you're not copying this exact pattern, so we're trying to take from what happens here and apply it. This is a cast shadow here. And we've got that hair. Next up is the basic rule on how to render hair. It goes a little something like this. Large to small. And this large to small is our brush behavior, the little texture thing. So asking yourself, is it etched in? Is it an actual scale? How does the hair actually behave? If you're drawing hair with tiny little brush strokes, you're doing yourself a disservice. You're not really capturing the large pieces of hair that get crumpled together. So how does the hair really behave? It sticks together. It's kind of like it has oils in it, and those oils unite after there's water, and then they just kind of get stuck together. So we're working from large to small. We do most of our work with this large brush, just like we did with the scales. So most of this work, I'm just gonna do my own pattern. My brush isn't going very small, it's between here and here. Okay, and then this one, here and here. And when we shrink our brush again, we have to shrink it and get the next highlight level. So we're throwing that highlight this way. And every piece here you throw, you're going to have to address it later. Why did you throw that in? And if you're not going to edit it out. You're not going to paint it away. Some of you paint hair and just render on, you can't turn off your render button. And because you can't turn it off, you end up drawing just a big mess of hair that's supposed to read. We're thinking about three-dimensional objects. One object in front of another object in front of another object. So this little piece of highlight that I just threw casts a shadow. That object is in front of that object. Now I know what to do with my next small brush strokes. This highlight piece here has cast a shadow. I'm going to get some more pieces and cast shadows from there. This little piece cast a shadow. So everything is playing a role. There are some other pieces that are flyaway. And now I'm going to really shrink my brush, and this time I can start using that really small brush I tell you not to use. This is the only time you're allowed to use it, when you've established enough detail in the area. And you use it both in light and in dark. So you're using it in a light shade and a dark shade. And this is just, you can't figure out all of this texture behavior if you have to worry about color too. So just get rid of color for now. You don't need to worry about that. And you see, do you guys see any major detail in the shadowed areas? No, because where there's no light, there's no detail. So you don't have to go in there and start painting here, because then you're going to tell the story that there's light in this area. Don't bother adding detail where there can't be detail. Detail is only there because of light. And then finally is the highlight. The highlight happens on hair on a curve. So I'm just using Dodge tool for now. It works on a curve. So that's what I'm throwing in there. And this is the exact same method I used for the scales, just the scales took a little more work. And they need a little bit more planning because every one of those etches was, time was spent into making it symmetrical. So there's a little bit more symmetry, but luckily hair is a little bit more loose so you can have fun and be creative and not be so measured. And those tiny little pieces, those tiny little hairs travel on the outside. But remember, you can't just go over all this work and just start throwing crap everywhere. You have to just keep what you already did here. Wherever there's no light, there's just a little bit of shadow sitting around. Okay, so that's what you pick up out of this. If you want a little bit more detail, don't use a soft brush like I used. Use something that, either a hard brush or a chalk brush if you want to get that really textured look. And if you want to push the realism, you can shrink your brush all the way down to the actual width of the hair. Like we see here, one hair just flying out. And you can make that hair just completely not follow any of the order. That doesn't follow a specific direction. And that kind of pushes the realism because the smaller your brush goes, the more detail you're thinking about. And you don't have to cast a shadow for every one of these hairs. They're so thin, their cast shadow is just completely blended away. Okay? And for this piece right here, I think you're not separating the shadows from the midtones. You've kind of just outlined the midtones with another midtone. What happens, I think this is a bit lightened too. What you have to do is, just like in the scales, we're bringing the shadow in only where it's needed. So in between the darkest crevices. And we work our way up from that. Also, don't underestimate the power of your edge when it comes to form studies and texture studies. Sometimes cleaning up and not having those fuzzy edges like you have here really helps with the texture, and it pushes the feeling of the texture. So I guess I'll use a hard brush for that. Just like this. Cleaning it up completely. You can soften it with another kind of brush, but cleaning up an edge really does a lot for bringing in detail without having to shrink your brush. And it's a lot of stuff we covered today, lots and lots of stuff. The hair shouldn't be this dark. It should be a little bit lighter than this. I do want to see this method for homework for at least for the rest of the days before our next day. I think we're going to do a theme for eyes next week. So you guys can do eye homework, but I also want to do, maybe the week after actually, because I want to focus on some general images, general drawings for Tuesday and Thursday. But please do the homework in this order. See how much easier it makes your life to get separating two major aspects of the rendering. One side for the three-dimensional and one side for the actual detail and texture behavior, and observing the way that the texture actually happened. If you confuse those two stages together, you'll create something that looks very messy. And detail takes a long time, so don't confuse the speed at which I work today, as that's how you're supposed to do it. If you're sitting there on the detail for quite some time, that's an appropriate amount of time for the amount of detail expected of you. I used lots of shortcuts today. I used layer modes. I used dodge tool and burn tool. You should not be depending on these tools. This is just because I have only so much time for the class, and I have to demonstrate and critique. But you guys should be adding, observing the texture, seeing how much work you can put in that small amount of time. Do you guys have any questions? The shape of the hair is too hard to visualize, but I like what you're doing. Well, I guess, yeah, it doesn't really make any sense at this point, but maybe I can make it make a little bit more sense. Hair is so random, you can't really say it doesn't look realistic. Hair can do this, and it will. Hair does all kinds of crazy stuff. It's hair. But I think what you're saying is that it doesn't really do that. Kinda, it doesn't taper off enough. So maybe if I do this to finish that off, and then do something like that, and then cut this part off, and maybe it's like the side of her head or something. Maybe like I'm not really sure how to make sense of this hair. Actually, maybe if we add a little bit more this way. It can be just one piece, one curl piece, and then you have another curl piece on top, and another one, and then that would be like and this would be the neck. So yeah, you can make sense of this hair. It just depends on how it was, I guess, curled. I do like that color blocking helps. Yeah, color blocking, or try to get it in grayscales first. Color will just get in your way, and once you know your grayscales are set, then you can transfer it into color very easily. You really like the theme this week. Thank you, Oreo. Does anybody have any questions regarding today's process? Does Someone's name is Lovely Farts. Was it just painting textures? Yes, it was. That was the theme. It was breaking down textures, trying to figure out how to render them in detail, extensive detail. That's kind of... Istebrak, do you usually recommend overlapping light wisps of individual strands of hair over the dark areas? Not a lot, but to give it more realism. Yes, I do more, Deb. I think it's really cool when you show hair, the flyaway hairs, as not following the growth order or the grain of the hair. So this is the grain of the hair, and if you drew something that goes this way or that way, that's really good because that's what flyaway hairs do. They don't follow the grain. So yeah, it would add realism. So yeah, go for it. And I wanted to show one thing to you guys, this awesome chainmail brush if you guys want it. I found it today. I'm sure all of you have it. It's like this super famous brush. But God, look at this, so slow. 30 mixed. Okay. So let's see. So it's basically an overlay, I think, of chainmail. And what you can do is paint it in darks. There's also one that you can actually paint that's an actual C-shaped brush that has a scatter that is very specific to chainmail. But right here, you just have to know how to fit it in. Just like that. And placing in the highlight, so it's transparent, so what you have to do is paint underneath it. And that kind of finishes it for you. So if you ever have ridiculous stuff like this and you want to just find some order in it, what's awesome is that these you can choose how highlighted it is, how bright it goes, because it's a negative. Just like that. Decrease opacity. So let me know if you guys want this brush. I can just upload it on. There's a couple of others. I'm gonna find some more, but it's really cool sharing these brushes. There's this one. This one's kind of fun. But again, this one is kind of off. They're negatives, so it's hard to find the perfect balance. But you can always edit it and then copy paste it. And then there's the one that is actually, I'm still trying to find that one. I had it before. I don't know who designed it, but it just basically does this as you paint. So you're always making the chainmail pattern. I mean, you could always paint it yourself, but it's just too much work, especially if you're freelancing. It's just so stupid. You know they're not paying you enough to do that. So that's another tip here. But as for this piece, I think you're doing great so far. I think you don't really have anything to worry about. What I recommend is just using the negative and positive spaces here to add in some of that detail that we see. So you see these lines here? You can just do a little something like that. Instead of just stippling. And this little piece here is a little brighter than that. Metallic, I did a class on metallic surfaces. They're really, really bright. They can be very bright, almost like mirror-like. As bright as as bright as a mirror almost. And I think that's it for today. Thanks everyone for, let me do a better one for YouTube. Thanks everyone for watching. I'll see you guys next week. Remember, 2 weeks from now the theme will be eyes. Don't forget to do homework for that. And I'll catch you guys later. Bye bye.